Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another show with the Catholic Money Mastermind. I'm your host, Ben Matinek, being joined together with another fellow member of the Catholic Financial Planners Network, a new member. His name is Brian Wayne. So, Brian, can you say hello to the audience and maybe just share a little bit about where you're from and what kind of firm you work with as they get to know you?
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to be part of the Catholic Financial Planners Network, for sure. So my name is Brian Wayne. I'm a financial advisor at a firm called Financial Advisors in South Central Pennsylvania, in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. We're a comprehensive financial planning firm. We're fee only. We're faith-based. We're independent. We're team focused. And our goal is really just to work with clients, but always coming at it from a lens of faith. And so when we do our life planning, it's about really diving into their goals, their values, but really what is God calling them to? What do they think their purpose is? And then try to make their finances fit their God-given purpose. And our faith just works into everything that we do in our financial planning and our investment management. And so it's just been great to journey with people and walk with them along that financial journey.
Brian, it's so awesome that you're working with a firm of that nature. I will say, I think a lot of the advisors within Catholic Financial Advisors, the Catholic Financial Planners Network, have a focus, Catholicism is important to them. It's part of how they advise and to some degree part of the firm's identity, but it's not every day that we see it where the firm is like saturated as your firm is, in which it is a central motif as to how you conduct business. And I think that's relevant, folks. Certainly give a chance to go and follow up with Brian and meet out. We'll give you some contact information both in the show notes and later on in the show if you'd like to reach out to his firm and connect with him. But what's going to be so important and the connection at the heart of our conversation today is some of the work that Brian does with the clients that he works with, and that's like managing this, these commitments, responsibilities, these calls that we have as Christians, as Catholics. And although we firmly believe that, wealth is ultimately a response or product of the goodness of God and the glory of creation, as you look upon it, God is not lacking in his generosity or beneficence. There is yet something unique in Christianity in which we're very much called to maybe a poverty of spirit. It comes right within the Beatitudes. And so there's a question that, we're wrestling with, what we were going to share with you in today's conversation. And I think it's very much the work that Brian has with his firm and the work that they have with their clients of what's the right balance of acquiring financial, assets for ourselves and make sure that we're well taken care of and, we're tending to our own needs, but then also not living in this place of excess and indulgence and being willing to live more fully the gospel message of pouring ourselves out in love to others. And what is holiness? What does charity demand or require of us? And, as much as we believe in the great beauty of God's creation and that wealth can ultimately participate in that, God at the same time has, he's not calling us to be wealthy necessarily. He's calling us to be holy. So maybe we start there, Brian, with just, some of the thoughts that you had from the Second Vatican Council and the universal call to holiness. You had shared with me that's something that's been really a central theme into your own, understanding your own walk. How does that resonate or speak to you?
For sure. Oh, thanks for asking. I would say the teaching that has been most pivotal for me from the Second Vatican Council, right? It comes from Lumen Gentium, which is, there are 4 major apostolic constitutions from the council. Lumen Gentium was kind of the highlight of it. It's really the church reflecting on who it is and what it's who makes up it and what are we ultimately called to. And then from that flows the rest of Christian living. And so right in the middle of Lumen Gentium, chapter 5, it's called the Universal Call to Holiness chapter. And most of us, I think, have at least heard that phrase used before. Hey, we're called to be holy. That's the vocation of each and every Christian every single Catholic, called to be holy. But it was pivotal for me as I read that chapter even more. You can kind of ask the question, like, what does it actually mean to be holy? Right? It's just it's a word that's out there, but let's give it a little bit more meat to it. And so, right, the very next line after it says, hey, we're all called to be holy. It says, well, what is holy? It says, holiness is this perfection of charity or perfect love. That to be holy means to love perfectly. And then if you keep reading, there, just like another 2 sentences, the council goes in and says, like, to move towards perfect love, we would encourage every Christian, according to their state of life, to pursue the evangelical counsels. The evangelical counsels are poverty, chastity, obedience. They're the things that we're so used to, like religious, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, like they take these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But the council, the Second Vatican Council, was saying, like, every single Christian, if they really want to love more perfectly, should incorporate these counsels in their life in some way. And so I was just, reflecting on that idea of incorporating evangelical poverty, like gospel poverty, whatever that means, right? To really, like, to center your life around that, because it opens you up then to loving in more powerful and extraordinary ways. And so that's kind of been the thought process I've had for a while as I've settled into this financial planning profession. That ultimately, if we approach it in the right way, it can lead to greater acts of love and service towards others.
Yeah, that's such an interesting reflection, right? Because we have in the Beatitudes, I think is what's tied into that, especially evangelical poverty, like, blessed are you poor, or blessed are you poor in spirit, you will inherit the kingdom of God. And what is our treasure? Like, what is our reward, or what is the kingdom of God? Like, it's, there's so many passages from the gospel of giving away everything. The poor, the rich young man that we just had on the Gospels recently, who wanted to follow Christ more deeply, and what was suggested to him is, I've followed the commandments, I've done all these things. Like, what's next? Like, what's my next thing? And he says, you are to sell everything you have and give it all away to the poor, and come follow after me. So, like, there's no question, like, as Christians, we can't just sit and accumulate stuff and somehow be comfortable with it. Like, it's just like through and through all of our documents, all our teachings, like, we're not necessarily demanded to become religious. We don't have to actually take on forms of poverty. There's something obviously beautiful and a great witness in that, but we are at least to mimic it spiritually, right? Like, we are okay. We're detached, I would say, minimally from the things of this earth. I suppose I'm kind of curious. I have my thoughts on this, but why do you think there's this connection between poverty and charity, and the need for poverty for us to exercise charity? Like, what do you think maybe the church is getting at, Christ is getting at, and teaching us to be poor as part of our need in order to be loving? Do you have a sense maybe in that, Brian?
Yeah. I would say, I think poverty provides a radical openness to others. So just as an example of some saints, right? So St. Louis and Zélie Martin, St. Therese's parents. So most of us know St. Therese, a little flower. So her parents have been canonized saints. They were the very first married couple canonized together as a married couple back only in 2015. And a lot of people think, like, oh, they were canonized because Therese was a saint. The reality is, no, Therese was a saint because her parents were saints. And there's this great scene Zélie writes about in her letters, and Therese reflects on later, that Louis was out for a walk with Therese, and they were walking to the park, and they came across an old man who was clearly cold and hungry. And so Louis, Therese's father, said, hey, gave Therese some money and said, hey, go give this to this man. But then they ultimately found out that he needed more than just a little bit of money. So he invited him to come back home with them, gave him some shoes, some clothes, served him at table that night. He eventually got hospice care for this man and just kind of served him until he ended up dying not that long later. And Therese reflects on this as this pivotal moment in her life where she saw the Father's love mimicked or imitated by her earthly father. But it was Louis and Therese, they had this radical openness to this charity, and they weren't poor themselves. Like Zélie ran a lace making business. Louis was a watchmaker. They served kind of the wealthy echelon of society, but they recognized that their wealth was to be spent caring for their kids and then sharing with the needy. And that's how they arranged their whole life. We have like the notebooks that Louis left of making sure that he was giving enough to the poor, that kind of thing. But I would say that poverty spirit provides a readiness or an openness that without which you just are closed off to opportunities of love.
Right. I mean, isn't it at the heart, right? I mean, of riches, that what we see come up within us, and it's really one of the big motivators when it comes to humans. Like two of the levers in terms of human emotions when it comes to money are either fear or greed. And really specifically with poverty, the issue here is greed. But I mean, fear is never really far that removed. Like part of why I'm greedy is because I'm afraid of not having it all or not having enough or running out. And maybe I'm afraid of being poor, right? And so that's what makes me greedy is I don't want to be poor. And so we become focused in on ourselves, and we, I mean, it's just completely inhospitable as Christians. At least it would be in complete, contrary to our faith. But if we believe in the providence of God and that God is a loving Father who seeks to take care of us, and that, the hairs on our head are counted, that, the sparrows, don't have to worry for nothing. Going back to, the Sermon on the Mount, like greed, is getting in the way of that. It's not us believing that God will take care or provide for us. It's us. I need to take care of myself, and I'll take care of other people once I have first taken care of myself. But then the real challenge with that is like, when do we ever take care of ourselves enough? Whenever is it sufficient? It's like there's this need almost, I would say, for it to be sacrificial, right? Like we know, like it's good for you to be covered, but like we don't, like where's the sacrifice? Like if there's never this pouring out, maybe to pivot to that scriptural passage from St. Paul, if there's never a pouring out of ourselves, then, were we ever charitable, even if we were charitable? Like, if we do, if we haven't really eradicated this greed in our hearts and only developed this trust in God's providence, it doesn't matter. I suppose that's the thing. Like, what's the most critical or important thing of our work, our journey here? And it's clear it's not accumulating wealth. So I suppose, Brian, like what's your take in terms of how, I don't know, asset accumulation, wealth accumulation?
Yeah.
How does this get in the way of us, loving others? Do you think it only is greed? Is it along these lines? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would say I use greed and fear. And I think greed in the sense of, right, wanting more and more. Like, I can be greedy. I want the nicer car. I want the bigger house. I want that experience. I just need to add more stuff to my life, which is really kind of masking often like this pursuit that like God isn't enough, like that other things are going to be able to fill voids in my life. So I think there's greed, but you said fear too. And I feel like fear steps in, especially with the idea of people who might not live a greedy life, but they want to keep accumulating because they're afraid that the government's going to cause some big, they're going to take away my social security checks, or I'm going to have 10 years of long-term care needs, or just thing after thing. Like I could have every one of these extreme things happen to me, and I just have to have the money to afford it. So fear can kind of drive away the reliance or the trust in God in a lot of ways as well.
Right. We're so relationship driven. I mean, you can think of the caricature in the movies of the businessman who's just a workaholic and he spends all his time working, 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 usually under the notion of wanting to provide or take care of his family. But then what kind of relationship is what in the family when, he's missing these important events and isn't present to them because he's so consumed with his work. And like the point of the work was to have this relationship and support that, and it actually ended up spoiling the relationship. And then it could be for what? Maybe it was for all these various concerns or worries or fears, and wanted to protect against them, which maybe in their own right seems like, okay, these are reasonable things for you to be doing. But then it you lost, in this relationship, as it's portrayed, you lost the very thing that you were hoping to keep or have.
Yeah.
And so that seems to be like what's at the heart of this. Like if we're just greedy, like there's no way we can be charitable and loving and present, and there's really no way we can be living faith, where we're like reliant on God and saying, look, this is yours, and I'm trusting you. I trust in your providence. I trust in your care. I believe that you have a plan for me in my life, and that I don't have to be the one to decide all this. And what comes to my mind in such a dramatic way is like just, St. Francis of Assisi and his just completely like stripping away, like going back to this evangelical poverty and just like letting it all go and having to say, God is enough for me. Like, I don't need all this stuff to be happy. In fact, actually, none of this stuff will make me happy no matter how much I have of it. Like the only thing that will give me happy and contentment in this life is God. And so let's prioritize that. And then the rest of these things, they are what they are, right? Is this kind of at the heart of it for you? Is St. Francis of Assisi too? Is he, maybe to bring it back to the Second Vatican Council, do you find that maybe St. Francis is almost the perfect illustration, especially as evangelical poverty, the perfect illustration of the call to holiness? Is that who the church is thinking of almost in a way, do you think?
For sure. And, it's interesting the way the church structures Lumen Gentium is that they have the chapters on like the bishops and priests, and then the laity, and then the call to holiness. And then they have the chapter on the religious life, following on the call to holiness, as if to say like, hey, these religious, they are the ones that we should look to be inspired by how to live poverty, chastity, obedience. But I also know like we can sometimes dismiss it. I feel like, Francis, I mean, he's amazing. I love, having a statue of him outside my house.
Sure.
But he didn't have kids, and he didn't have the stressors of daily life that I need and that I have. And so I think it takes a lot of humility to be able to look to the example of the religious, but also like married saints. I probably feel like 20 or so years now have been in the daily life of the saints type spirit, like, reading about what's happening with saints of the day, each day for forever. And honestly, I don't think I've ever come across a lay saint who hasn't had, I'll steal Father Thomas Dubé. He calls it a sparing, sharing lifestyle. That there's not a lay saint out there that I've ever come across who doesn't have a lifestyle where they are sparing towards their own self so they can be more sharing with others. That it's pivotal to the call to holiness, that it's not one of those kind of optional things like, oh, you can become really holy while also being very rich. Like you have to have that poverty of spirit to truly grow in the depths of holiness.
For sure. And maybe to echo then, so Brian, this is fundamentally, it's not that people have to factually be poor. We're not necessarily saying you should be evangelical, you should be pursuing an evangelical poverty, vow of poverty. Now, maybe you should. If you're being called to the religious life, but we readily recognize that that's not the right responsive path or vocation for everyone. It's something that God calls people to, but there is definitely this spirit of poorness, the spirit of poverty that's in play. And we could look to church teaching, which is, typically just alongside of all this, a 10% tithe. So, whatever your gross proceeds revenue are, to give 10% of that away. And, that is, to meet and do that, is fulfilling in a lot of ways your obligation. So like, let's do that. And if you choose not to do more than that, I would be hesitant for us to convey a sense that you're, I don't know, you've missed the mark. But it isn't like just, the Catholicism isn't just about just doing what's been asked of you to do. It's about the transformation that takes place in our heart and our soul. And what we're really trying to get at here, I think, is this notion of detachment. And maybe God could be moving you and asking of you to give much more than 10%. Like 10%, maybe we should be seeing as the minimum. Like you're passing the test, but you could very well be asked to be giving more than that, especially when we think of St. Paul's passage here out of 2 Timothy. And I'm going to go ahead and read it just to help set the tone of the rest of our conversation. But, St. Paul wrote to Timothy saying, "As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and will not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." And so, like, St. Paul in this passage is like, I've given myself completely over to God. And there's a reason why it's in the scriptures. Like, this is inspiring. It's moving. In some ways, it's, exemplary of the Christian life. And so, to give this some practical context, and maybe one last thought before we give it into practical context, the way that we were chatting on this before we started recording, that I just love, there's a Christian artist, Matt Maher, who's captured this whole motif so well in a song called Empty and Beautiful. So maybe we'll reference that. But, if you're wanting, like, what's another way to take all this and not have it be so heady, listen to Matt Maher's song, Empty and Beautiful. But that does kind of capture it, like this pouring myself out completely and being empty as a result. And yet you would think that becoming empty, like somehow, like I've lost everything. Like, that's the great irony. It's like, actually, no, that's now you've been made beautiful. And so like, what are some of your thoughts, I think, with just maybe these last comments of like the greater good, Brian? Like, what is it that we do get? It's not like we're just giving something else up. Like, what is the better good that we receive when we do pour ourselves out?
I mean, the short answer is love, right? But to go back to the idea of the tithing, as setting a minimum of sorts, it's interesting because the New Testament doesn't pick up the tithe too much, but there's a great line from Jesus. It's in the part where he's yelling at the Pharisees and scribes, and he's like, "Woe to you!" And he talks about, he says, like, "Woe to you! Like, you tithe the mint and dill and cumin, all this spice. Like, you give your 10%, but you ignore the weightier matters of the law: love, justice, mercy, peace." And he says, "These you should go after without neglecting the first things." So the idea that, like, doing the tithe is great. Don't neglect it. But Jesus is always like, do that, but then go more. Like the rich young man, right? You've done this. Now go more. And the going more is like that emptying invitation is to further justice. It's to further peace, love, like all of those things. Like, when we're empty, we can be filled with those virtues, with those gifts from God, this fruit of the Spirit, right? Only by being empty can you become love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, generosity. All those fruits well up in one's life.
Right. And that ultimately, I mean, this is the greater good, right, folks? For the listeners, like this is why. I mean, I almost it would be hesitant to be like, this is the motivation, this is why you should do it. But like, this is like, you're giving up a lower good for a greater good would be the simplest way to describe this. It's not as if you're not getting anything in return, so it's not a no, material goods are bad. These, shy away, push them away. Like, it's not because they're not good. Like, that's not why we're pushing them away. They are good, but there is still greater goods to be pursued. And we don't want these lower goods, which again are good, to get in the way of the greater good. And I think that's probably at the heart of all of this, is like, let's not turn, the things of creation into their creator. Let's not make them the idols that we worship and love. Let's make sure that what we worship and love is the true and the living God. And so that's, I don't know, I think that's the need for the poverty. That's the need for the detachment, is that it helps us keep, the real God as our God and not some other God, which would, basically whatever material possessions or greed or assets or your 401k or your income coming in or the taxes or the government or whatever that God might be when it comes to financial matters. Let's make sure that's not our God. So yeah, this is like this is cut on me, to have this conversation. I must say, Brian, I'm really glad you've brought it up. Folks, as you're considering these things, what I'd like to do is pivot to how Brian does work, with his clients in these, like, what's practical considerations to have, in light of this conversation. But, if you're looking for an advisor to help you, not just make good sense of your finances and the money that you make and the expenses and the assets and your retirement plan. There's a whole number of things that a good advisor would do. And we've got a whole bunch of them at Catholic Financial Planners Network. But part of our, work here is not just simply to provide these material advice, but throughout the network is also to have advisors help lead you, to be a guide of sorts to a greater Christian witness, especially if that's something that you're seeking or wanting to have in the advisor. We're hoping to connect and provide that to you as well. And Brian, especially as another member of the network, you could reach out to Brian and his firm, which is committed to this, as LifeGuide. Oh, is it LifeGuide Financial, Brian? That's the name of the network, right? Or your firm?
Yes. Yeah. LifeGuide Financial.
Yeah. But like, that's what they do here. So you definitely be sure to consider Brian as you're looking for an advisor. But like, Brian, how do you take some of these sentiments, these teachings, these ideas that we've been floating around, and bring them into practical consideration for clients as, they're making everyday decisions on what to save, what to spend, what to give away, what to keep for themselves? Like, how do you work with clients to help them have this conversation?
Definitely. Yeah, I would say I'd share two things, or two practical ways in which we do this. And it's establishing these things called finish lines. I think, we use that story from St. Paul, right? At the end of his life, this is, he's in prison, he's writing to Timothy. He's like, Timothy, I've run the race. I've been poured out like a libation. From now on, right, the crown of glory awaits. And so we use this idea of finish lines. It's the idea of, let's run this race well. We only have one life. Let's do it well, according to God's plan. And so these two finish lines, these two things we aim for, one is around our spending and one is around our saving. So just to start with the spending finish line. The first time I heard about this, I was listening to a podcast, a sermon from Pastor Rick Warren. This was like 20 years ago. The Purpose Driven Life just had come out. And he was sharing how he and his wife, Kay, had spent a long time, maybe a couple of years, really asking the question, how much does God want us to spend? And I think there's a great question for Christians. Like, we often ask the question, like, as a Christian, well, how much am I supposed to give? There's I think a better way of kind of treating it is sometimes, how much does God want me to keep? And so that's Rick and Kay. He was talking about how they were really focused on that question of, how much does God want us to keep? If we get to this spending level, like, that's what we'll stop. And I don't remember what the number was for him. I don't even know if he shared it. It might, let's throw out 60,000, right? So if 60,000 is what I need to spend on my life, if God ever gives me more than that, right? That extra, that's his, that's God's. The idea being, like, I've sat in prayer, and I would challenge anyone to, like, go to adoration, sit in front of the Eucharist and just ask the question, like, God, how much are you calling me to live off of? Like, what is the top of my lifestyle supposed to be? Right? Because the world is going to say, hey, whenever you get more income, just increase your lifestyle. Get more income, increase your lifestyle. Right? That lifestyle creep that brings no joy with it. So it's helping people, find that first finish line. Like, how much do you really think God is asking you to keep? And then it's very easy when you're making much less. So if you're working with like 20, 30-year-olds who are just out of college, all this debt, right? They're not near their finish line. It's a lot harder if you've made a lot of money and God might be asking you to cut back. But that's the first idea, is like, instead of thinking of giving as a percentage, all right, think of it as, okay, God's asking me to keep this much. If he wants to bless me and increase my salary again and again, right? Whatever's extra, like that's his. And we can get very practical about like, okay, well, every now and again, we're going to have like college savings built in there. And we're going to have these other goals that are good to have, right? That you do have a call to care for your kids and your family, but it's, set a line. Once you settle, 'cause a lot of times we think like, okay, once I'm content, that'll be my finish line. And the reality is, it's not until you choose the finish line that God then blesses you with contentment. You're like, oh, I do have enough. I sat with God, and God said, this is where I need to be. Once I have that, I can be content with that. And then you're freed up. Like, you have so much freedom at that point to give, to love, to pour into the lives of other people. So,
Brian, would you
first finish line?
Pardon me, Brian, what you say there is just, I think, so true. And I mean, I can speak of it in just my own life, my own testimony of it. We all think this. And I mean, there are studies. This isn't necessarily a religious themed item. There are studies done with, human contentment and happiness. And it's definitely, the goalposts that are always being pushed further and further off. We think and feel that if, I make $100,000 as a household, that'll make me happy. And then it's 150,000, and then it's 200,000. And there's always the next thing, the next toy, the next car, the next house, the next vacation, the next thing that I need to do for my family. And maybe it was covering their college education, but now it needs to cover their wedding. And now maybe it needs to cover for the grandkids. Like, it's just, as we make more money, we can always just keep finding new things. Again, things that are good. We don't want to be saying these are bad, but we're trying to feel like when enough's enough. And like, when I don't need to be anxious or concerned or worried about my money, when I have enough, like our natural desire will always be to keep stretching that out. And then we'll always continually feel like we're just never quite where we need to be, like it's, oh man, we're just never making it. And yet, like, losing track of all how we've progressed and how things have been blessings to us and how we are maybe a good way or a good pathway, but it's because we're stretching out those goal lines. So, I mean, what's interesting about this focus of just setting the finish line and then saying that, look, this brings contentment to it, like even religious considerations aside, like, I mean, I think just like establishing the goal line so it doesn't move anymore on us. Like, this is the finish line. Like, okay, like, don't keep pushing it out. Don't let lifestyle creep come over. Like, yeah, like naturally enough, like that probably would. Like, that's just needs to happen regardless of who you are. But then certainly within maybe the eyes of faith, trusting. I think what the worry that comes with this, that hopefully the eyes of faith, the response of faith would give or have, is like, I can trust that whatever I establish as that finish line and the line, putting it in stone, like, this is enough. It's like we trust in the providence of God. Like, if God has told me, if I believe, that this is what it's enough for me, then that's enough for me. Like, I won't let my lesser passions or desires start to stretch or push that away. I can let his word, speak truth and light to it, and let that be sufficient. And so, and it's like, I feel like what's beautiful about this is it allows that, it sounds or seems to let that happen. Like, let's put the line of saying this is enough, so that we can have that, like, oh, okay, this is enough. Like, I don't need more. Has that been what you've experienced as you've worked with clients? Is that like firming this finish line up, the spending finish line? Like, this is what they take away when you've done that for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, well, one, we can't sugarcoat it. Like, it is a hard message, because it is contrary to, right, every message that they receive in the world. So it's, it'd be great if, we could just have this one conversation and every client is like, oh yeah, this sounds great, let's do it. But it's a matter of like, maybe setting it just a little bit lower, and then just a little bit lower. If people have been prone to live in excess, Because we often compare ourselves to the people that we are surrounded by, which tend to be people in the same socioeconomic class, right? And so if we're surrounded by people who are doing very, very well financially, we'll often say, oh, okay, well, I'm not doing as well as that person, so I'm doing all right. So it's those who have accepted it and like have tried to bring it into their life. It really does produce contentment. It produces excitement. So that's what's really cool. When people come in and they're like, hey, remember when you said that I didn't need that much? I could give away this much. Well, I did it. It's been great. And they'll like share all their experiences. So that's exciting. I was thinking I should probably finish the story about Pastor Rick Warren. So
please. Yeah. Did we lose track? I'm glad you're coming back to it. Yeah.
So he set his finish line, and like a month or two later is when his book, The Purpose Driven Life, went viral. And he started making millions upon millions from this book. But he had already established his finish line. And then after that, that's when God was like, okay, now I can trust you with this great amount of wealth. So he was talking about how, at this point, his tithe is 90% of his income because he set his finish line and everything else went towards God's work. So it does just give you that freedom to say, like, I don't need to be tied to my finance. Like, I can hold on to it loosely. Because I know God is going to bring opportunities to me to love. So,
yeah. And that, I think along with that this isn't what's going to make me happy anyhow. Like, as much as we think that, I mean, I think that I want that. Like, I kind of like believe that to be true, right? Or maybe I mostly believe that to be true if I'm honest. Like, I think if I just get more and more money, that like somehow I'm going to be happy. And I don't know, again, this response of faith is to say, actually, I've given up on that lie. Like, I don't believe that anymore, and I'm not willing to believe that anymore. And I'm willing to step out here, kind of with these themes of like poverty in spirit, pouring myself out, being contrarian and not listening to maybe a message of the world, but listening to the message of the word, and say, if Jesus was born into this world into, the humbleness of a manger, and, his own public ministry was one in which he had no place to lay his head. And he ultimately, obviously, concluded his life with his death on the cross, in which he poured himself out completely. Like, if that was all enough for him and God blessed him, raised him up, like, it'll be enough for me too. Like, I don't need all these other things either. And like, that's like, wow, it's like, that's a message that I need to hear. I just think, any of us, like, as followers, like, we need to hear that, especially because we live in a society that's so driven by, success and money and how that demonstrates itself in financial terms between cars and houses and pools and just all these things, all these things that we're chasing after. Like, let's flip this in on its head. So I mean, Brian, as we kind of bring things to a close, you have some of these concrete lines that you work with your clients to implement and say, it's not just you deciding this. I mean, it's in collaboration, it's in prayerful consideration with what we believe God is asking of somebody. But it sounds like, we're going to figure out what the finish lines are between maybe spending and savings. Are there other implications as to how you take these, messages and bring them, into practical play for somebody?
Yeah. Well, I kind of shared like that spending finish line, the savings finish line. I'll just go real briefly. What that flows from, I think the parable of the rich fool, which when I started financial planning a few years ago, like this was the parable that was most distressing for me. I was like, should I be in this business? So parable rich fool, right? There's this guy, he has this great abundant crop, and he's like, there's so much, it fills up my barns, but there's more. And what am I supposed to do with this? And the guy's like, well, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns to build bigger ones. Then I can store up my grain. Then I can just take it easy. I can kind of do the retirement where I just eat, drink, and be merry for the rest of my life. And Jesus is like, you fool, tonight your life is demanded of you. And what are you going to show for it? Because you have spent your life on the riches of the world and not the riches of God. And so I was like, oh, am I just helping people build bigger barns? Because Like that's
Mhm.
something we really have to be careful with in our heart. So I think of that rich fool, and I think of his experience that he built barns originally, and he probably built them with the capacity of, to hold what he would deem as enough. If I ever got these barns full, I would have enough. And so God gave him this great abundant crop. He filled up the barns, but he was like, oh, now I have more. Like, instead of just accepting that he had enough and giving away the rest, he chose instead to tear it down and kind of turn it all in on himself. And so that second finish line, that savings finish line, it's really about establishing, well, how much is enough to kind of live off of? And it's really connected closely with that first one, right? The lesser your lifestyle expenses, the less you need to live on like retirement. Because when we talk about savings, you can think of like the Israelites. They were meant to, save when they went out to get manna, right? They were supposed to get enough for one day. On the sixth day, they were enough to get 2 days, but no more, right? So God always commands us just to save enough, but not to be excessive in our saving. And so and I think this is where financial advising can be super, super helpful in someone's life. And we've seen it this way is we're trained in being able to run the numbers, being able to understand, the Monte Carlo simulations and all those kinds of things to figure out, hey, with this amount, if this is what you saved up and this is how much it takes each year to save to this, or right, if you saved this much amount 10 years from now, this is what we'd expect it to be. We can come to a pretty good idea of how much is enough for your lifestyle. And so if you show up with millions of extra dollars and we're saying like, hey, your lifestyle doesn't require all this. You're free to do with this what you want, what you think God is calling you to. And like, you don't have to hold on to that. Like, this is like your funds to live out your God-given vocation and to love in incredible ways. Like it's creating like our mission statement is to help families achieve financial peace and freedom to make eternal impact. And so it's about giving them a number. Like this number is free from your retirement needs. What are you going to do? What do you think God wants you to do with it? And so that's the idea of like a savings finish line. It's like, hey, let's not try to save more than necessary. Let's save just enough, relying on God, right? Because He's the provider. He'll provide the provision. And then if we've saved to that point, like even if we're still in our working years, like we don't need to keep saving more and more, right? We might get to the point where you can stop saving. You have your enough. So it's those kinds of conversations that we've gotten to have with clients and define actual numbers and give people real freedom to pursue. Like we do this financial planning, this life planning before we get into the finances, and people have to really nail down what is most important to them. What do they feel God is calling them to? And then we can make the finances serve those purposes and that mission that they feel called to. And so that's just an exciting way that we get to do financial planning with our clients.
Well, I mean, I think that's hits upon it so well, like this notion of making sure that our finances are serving us and the goals that we want it to be, and not the other way around. And if nothing else, like this is why the importance of having certain goals and having these concrete lines, as we've been getting at, like even just like stepping away from a little bit of a religious conversation and just being like, no, like psychologically, practically, like regardless of your faiths or your world beliefs, like having really specific goals allows us to know when we've either achieved that goal or when it's been met. And then it lets us know that we don't like, well, the goal's been met. Like it doesn't keep getting further and further and further away from us. And like in a lot of ways, this is a beautiful religious expression and illustration, but it's also just a really practical illustration that regardless of what kind of planning we're doing for anybody, like in some ways, good planning necessitates this no matter what, because of the human tendency in all of us, we believe it ultimately to come from original sin and our fallenness, but I mean, that can be, people explain that in different ways, right? I mean, that the explanation aside, like human beings, I think without question, like few people would would disagree with this, have this tendency to always push the goal away and live in this constant fear of like, I'm never getting there. It's never happening, regardless of what they've made, what kind of achievements they have seen in their life. And so like, this is now just like, we're accomplishing the same thing, but good planning should do regardless. But then saying like, well, it actually is very much part of the Christian message too, for us to do this, because it does allow us just to say, okay, I'm, as we have seen with the evangelical poverties, like with witnesses such as St. Francis of Assisi, we just give it all away. Like, God is enough. He's our treasure. He's our reward. Like, having him is sufficient. Like, becoming loving and charitable is really the outcome, the intent of this life. And becoming holy is its intent, not necessarily passing on a big inheritance or being famous or having this name or whatever the many ways in which we can get kind of distracted from these goals. So I love it. I love that, I feel like, Brian, you're doing good planning, but you're also like fulfilling, like at a base level, like just our Christian commitments, like making it very Christian at the same time, and giving a sense of like, making sure that we're having prayerful consideration of what these limits should be, and not just like some Monte Carlo simulation that says what limits ought to be. And then giving ourselves the freedom, to say, okay, like we have hit the lines, we're fine. And let's rest in that, let's be free in that, to your point. So I've loved every bit of this conversation. This has just been wonderful. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed it too. I've taken some very deep fruit away from it. Brian, we're going to have you back on the show again here in the near future. It. Yeah. Thankfully, many members within the network, have backgrounds in theology and philosophy and scriptural study, and we can speak to some of these things. But I will say, I think so far to date, you're the most well-read in the scriptures among us. You represent us poor Catholics well. We're not always the best when it comes to speaking to the scriptures, but you've done, a beautiful job today. So, for folks who've been intrigued and would like to reach out and connect with you and see how you could be of help, what's the best way for them to contact you, Brian?
For sure. I think email is probably the best way. So our website is LifeGuide, FA, for financialadvisors.com. And then my email address is B for Brian and then Wayne. So bwayne@lifeguidefa.com. Okay,
guys. So Brian's located in the Pennsylvania area, but he'll work and redirect you as he can for anyone who would be a good fit. So please reach out to him. Consider also reaching out to everyone within the Catholic Financial Planners Network. So much of what we expressed and shared today, I think, is very much at the heart of the aspirations of the members of the network that we're building. And so, we'd love for you to give us a call and see if we can be of help in achieving similar goals in your own situation. So, Brian, thanks for being a member of the network. Thanks for being on the show today. And for all who've been listening, God's blessings to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. God bless you.